All right, so let's look at protists, okay? This is part of our classification unit. So obviously we're going to be looking at a little bit of classification as we do this. And protists are pretty interesting. So let's just jump right in. So some questions we want to be able to answer when we're done. Number one, what are the major characteristics of protists? Where did they evolve? How did they evolve? And what are the major groupings of protists? Okay, so those are the three questions we're after. So, what are protists? Well, they fall into the kingdom Protista. They're all single-celled. That's very important. They're eukaryotes, which we know means has a nucleus, right? EU means true, so a true nucleus. They do have most of our normal organelles, so things like the mitochondria, the vesicles, the vacuoles, the endoplasmic reticula, that kind of thing. They are found all over the place. All right, you can take a cotton swab and swab pretty much anywhere and find a bunch of protists. They are motile. All right, the word motile means able to move. All right, they can move about, and they are thought to be the ancestors for some more advanced species. Now, where did they come from? Well, we've already talked about the endosymbiote theory. Excuse me. Oh, bless me. Excuse me. Gracious, what in the world? Anyway, we've already talked about the endosymbiotic theory, in which case we looked at the fact that mitochondria have their own DNA, they have their own ribosomes, chloroplasts, same boat, right? They have their own DNA, own ribosomes. And the thought is that eukaryotes evolved from symbiotic prokaryotes. So the idea that there were prokaryotes that worked together may have lived within the same biological envelope and ended up becoming linked in such a way that they could not live without one another, and through or over time rather, eventually evolved or merged into an organism. So that's the idea about where they come from. Now, when we classify protists, we put them in three main groups. We put them in the animal-like group, we put them in the plant-like group, and we put them in the fungus-like group. Now, the animal-like protists, they eat food. They're heterotrophs. So you're going to see them engulf other organisms in order to digest them, maybe pick through detritus, right, which is a fancy word for like trash, but at the microscopic level. Those are going to be our heterotrophs. Those are our animal-like protists. Our plant-like protists are autotrophs. They're photosynthetic, so they're probably green, right? So if you see a green green protist, it's probably doing photosynthesis, okay? So it's going to be like a plant. It makes its own food. And then we have our saprophytes, the dendritivores, right? So things that are our decomposers, which just like fungus in the macroscopic world, right, the world that we see, these saprophytes are responsible for breaking down dead and decaying stuff at the microscopic world. So those are the three groups. Now, as far as how they move, we do want to be able to identify the three different main ways that a protist moves. So we have cilia, which look like little teeny tiny short hairs that kind of wiggle back and forth. There are flagella, which are the long tails that kind of whip side to side. And then some, like the amoeba, use pseudopods. Pseudo means false, pod means foot. And so, excuse me, pseudopods mean false feet. And the way that a pseudopod is formed is actually kind of cool. So the cytoplasm kind of pushes out on the cell membrane and it creates these like kind of runners. And then as the cytoplasm fills them up, the back end of the cell is pulled along with it. So the pseudopods are pretty unique to our amoeba. So here is an amoeba right here. And there is a pseudopod, right? All of these would be pseudopods. And so the cytoplasm is actually flowing kind of like a fluid into these two arms, right? Like that. And they will eventually come together. And then we have trapped food inside what is now a vacuole, right? We have a food vacuole forming right here. So that's what a pseudopod does. It's also obviously how it kind of crawls around. These little hair-like projections are called cilia. They kind of If you kind of think about like a rowboat, like a lots and lots of rowers, right? Lots of oars. They kind of beat in unison and they kind of like push through the water, and that's how this guy moves around. And here on our last fella, our Eubelina, we can see it's kind of green, so this is probably an autotroph. Okay, and right here you can see the flagellum, this long whip-like tail. Now, there are some common features that our prokaryotes share that are a little bit different from normal eukaryotes. They may have food vacuoles, which is where they store their food, and a lot of them have contractile vacuoles. Now, we looked at a video of this earlier in the year when we talked about organelles, but just to remind you, it's like a pump. It's the protist is living in a freshwater environment that is hypotonic, so water is always rushing into the cell, right? So if here is my cell, water is always going into the cell in a freshwater environment. And so if the protist didn't have a way to regulate this, it would eventually just swell up and pop. So the contractile vacuole, when it fills up, kind of just squeezes down and expels water from the cell. Like we just pointed out, many of them have a structure for movement. Now, there is a tremendous amount of diversity in the kingdom, in the protist kingdom. They reproduce, so because of there's all that diversity, it's kind of difficult to classify some of the different protists, and so a lot of times we end up looking at one of two things. We either look at how they reproduce, or we look at the energy, the way that they get their energy. So some of them can reproduce asexually, some can reproduce sexually only, and some can do both. As far as energy, this is the three main groups that we've looked at. Some can eat other food like heterotrophs. Some are photosynthetic, so they're autotrophs. Some can do both. Some are only one or the other, right? So we break them down that way. So let's look at a protist. Let's look at Eubelina. It is a plant-like protist, so it has chloroplasts. It moves with a flagellum. It has an eye spot, which helps it locate light. And that's a pretty useful thing if you're a photosynthetic protist, right? It can store up carbohydrates that it makes during photosynthesis, and it can use those for energy if it's hungry, right? So that's a pretty useful skill. Now, what's good about a protist? They are really, really small, right? And you may not think about them as integral to the ecosystem, but they are actually really important, okay? And in some cases, they are the absolute structure that holds up the ecosystem, like in the case of phytoplankton. Phytoplankton can help other species, protists can help other species by symbiosis, not just phytoplankton. And a great example of this is both the giant clam and the termite. So let's look at a giant clam. Take a minute, see if you can find it near this diver. If you're looking for it, this clam is this enormous structure right here. You can see those spots right there, those kind of green spots on the flesh of the clam. That is a dinoflagellate, which we call zooxanthellae. And it is a photosynthetic kind of protist. It can fix carbon, which is important for the overall organism there. And so there is symbiosis going on between the giant clam and that protist. The protist gets a home. The giant clam gets some carbon, which it needs. Here's another great example. This is a really zoomed in view of the polyps that make up a coral reef. And you can see that this part, the clear part with the little tentacle here, this is the animal-like portion of the polyp, but all of this um, is photosynthetic. And again, this is an example of a symbiotic relationship. That's its own little organism there. It, during the daytime, right, absorbs sunlight, does its photosynthesis, and the organism, the polyp there, benefits from that. So that's pretty useful. If it weren't for protists, termites would starve, which may be a good thing, right? If you've ever had termites in your house, you know they're not friendly. But termites are pretty unique because they can eat this, right? Cellulose, which we know is the sugar in plant cell walls, right? We call it fiber in the human diet. And the thing you know about fiber is you can't digest fiber, right? It keeps you regular, it makes you poop. Well, you don't get any nutrients from it. We don't have the enzymes that are needed in order to break that cellulose down. A termite has protists that live in its gut. They're right there, just like we have bacteria that live in our gut or protists that live in our gut. The termite has its own little microscopic ecosystem in there. And those protists are actually what breaks the cellulose down for the termite. And the termite gets sugar from it, which it needs, in order to live. So the protist and the termite there is in a symbiotic relationship, which is really good for the termite. Now, that's not to say that all protists are good. There are many different disease-causing protists, which we call pathogens. Dysentery is caused by a protist. Malaria is caused by a protist, and one that doesn't affect us, but the red tides are also caused by protists. So here's a red tide, and a red tide is caused by this bloom in protists that live in the ocean. Sorry, to keep my thoughts together there. And the problem is when there's so many of them in the water, they can clog the gills of fish, and the fish end up basically drowning, right? They can't get enough oxygen. Now, this can be caused by a lot of different things. Um, but one of the ways is over fertilization. So fertilization of like crop fields and stuff, and then you have a bunch of runoff, and then that runoff, that fertilizer can cause a bloom in this population, which then of course leads to a bunch of dead fish. The dead fish, of course, wash up on the shore. If they lay there uncared for, they could become a breeding ground for other diseases, which could end up affecting us. And if you live in a community that depends on those fish, and obviously so many of these fish die, you may struggle to get, enough fish in your diet for some time after that red tide event. Now, this is a picture of malaria. That right there, I believe, is Trypanosoma brucei, I believe, is the species. That's the trypanosome right there that causes malaria. This is a RBC, a red blood cell. And the problem with malaria, or the way that malaria goes about causing such damage, is this is the red blood cell, and you can see the trypanosome and the signet ring formation is kind of hidden inside the red blood cell. So the trypanosome eats a little hole, goes into the red blood cell, kind of hollows it out. Part of its life cycle is there, and then it busts free, and you lose a bunch of red blood cells, and that can obviously impact your ability to carry oxygen throughout your body and can ultimately lead to death if it's untreated. So trypanosomes, like this one here that causes malaria, is another protist that's not great as far as making friends. So hopefully you can now identify some major characteristics of protists. We've revisited the endosymbiotic theory, so you can talk about the evolution of protists, and the three major groups of protists. Right? Those are the big takeaway here. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll be glad to give you guys a hand.